Welcome everyone to Misguided the Podcast. I'm your host, Matthew Facciani, and today we're diving into the nuts and bolts of teaching critical thinking with educator and author Tim Redmond. Tim has a PhD in political science, wrote a book on political tribalism, and is currently a high school teacher in New York. We cover Tim's journey from musician to PhD student to high school teacher who built a standout critical thinking course from scratch. We talk about why identity sits at the center of our information habits, how to blend psychological literacy, media literacy, and scientific literacy, and the classroom lessons that actually stick. If you're new here, welcome. Thank you for joining. And if you're returning, thank you so much for joining me again. And if you have a moment, please hit follow and leave a quick rating or share this with someone you know. It really helps more people find the show. All right, let's get into it. Tim, thank you so much for joining me. It's great to chat with you today. Before we dive into all of the cool things that you've been working on lately, I was curious if you could share with my listeners just how you got into teaching critical thinking. What was that journey like from graduate school to teaching today?
Thank you for having me on, Matthew. I'm a big fan of your work, so I greatly appreciate your time. And it's been really a fascinating journey because when I was in grad school, so I went to University at Buffalo in political science and did my master's first and then I continued on with my doctorate. But I was playing music at the time as well, and so I was sort of living these two different lives, and I was doing school stuff when school was in session, but then when I got out of class and in the summer, my band and everything, we were going on tour, and then we do that all May, June, July, August, and then I'd come back and get back into class. And so I really had sort of this split life, and I wasn't doing a lot of maybe the research that grad students, I had some of my professors and advisors saying, hey, this summer we're going to this presidential library, we're going here, and why don't you come along? And I just never could do that because I was always doing music. And so then after I finished all my coursework and was working on my dissertation, it's like, am I going to be able to finish this and get a job? And because I didn't have any publications or anything because I was never doing any of that work over the summer. So I knew I wanted to teach and was trying to, figure out what I was going to do. And then eventually I finished it, my PhD, but in my dissertation. But in the meantime, to get some extra money, I started subbing in a high school and I fell in love with it. I fell in love with the age group. I was also teaching at the university at the time, and I love those classes as well. But I just felt with the younger kids, I was making so much more of an impression on them. I'm with them 5 days a week, and you get to know them better, and they're younger, right? So they're just learning a lot of this stuff. And so I kind of went down that road and started teaching high school. And I didn't really get into critical thinking stuff until I was out of grad school. And even I had been teaching for maybe 5-6 years. And then I just sort of got interested in it on my own. We would always talk about critical thinking in school and say, we're teaching you how to think critically. But that was more content specific. It was like, okay, so if we're doing a history class, and we're reading this primary source and we have to think, who wrote this and why might they have written this and that sort of thing. But nothing really with looking at our own biases and how we process information and the impact, with that you talk a lot about in your work, the impact that our identities have on how we perceive and evaluate information. And so that I just started, I came across some books on critical thinking and started reading it and got really, really fascinated with it and started taking my own journey because I had, that was a lot of new information for me. And I really started to, I always say, I wish I was in grad school maybe 10 years later, because when I was in grad school, political science was all about, we're going to come up with this model that's going to predict, we'll look at the unemployment rate, we'll look at polling, whether or not you're an incumbent, we're going to try to predict who's going to win the next presidential election, and that was basically a lot of political science at that time. And there was really no psychology in there. It's so much more, there's so much more cross-pollination now between psychology and political science. And that's really when I first started reading a lot of these books and research papers on this new sort of field in political science about how our identities and cognitive biases influence how we interpret political information. And I was just like fascinated by that stuff because I had never taken any psychology classes in college, and it was all new to me, completely blown away by this stuff. And that sort of started me down this critical thinking path. And so it was like these two passions, that I had: politics, American politics, and now critical thinking. And that overlap between the two fields was extraordinary. So I just spent a lot of time reading on it, studying it. And then I started a critical thinking elective at my school. It's a pretty big district. So I went through the whole process. You propose it to the curriculum council, and you have to, come up with sort of the curriculum, suppose, a syllabus, and go in front of the curriculum council and justify it, and then it's got to get approved. And so it was a couple of years in the making, and then like COVID happened, and so that delayed some things. And when schools reopened, that's when the course sort of rolled out, and I've been doing it ever since. Our district has 3 high schools, so they're doing it at 3 different high schools. And I teach it once in the fall semester, once in the spring semester. It's a half-year course, so I'm getting 50 to 60 kids a year, getting them this material, and it's been great. So it's really been sort of a interesting journey. It wasn't a direct thing. It wasn't something I was studying in college, but the political science stuff actually did introduce me to it once those two fields kind of came together. And I wish, because I think I probably would have done a lot more research. It's hard to say because I love doing the music stuff too, but I find that research so much more fascinating. And so that was sort of my journey and where I'm at now, and what led me to write the book and a lot of these articles I write. It's all sort of critical thinking and politics. The politics is my background, and critical thinking just sort of became a passion.
Wow, that's really interesting for several reasons to hear like a interdisciplinary background. I always find that interesting because of my own interdisciplinary background, but also your particular story is kind of the inverse of mine, where I started with psychology and critical thinking, and then I got into politics. So it's just kind of interesting to see the flip side of that, because I never really was that interested in politics until 2016, 2017. I started studying it a bit more when fake news and misinformation became this political thing. But I was actually, I got to study that field before it was so overtly connected to politics in our public discourse. So I just think it's interesting.
You were sort of like interested in religion first, right? Like psychology and religion?
Yeah. So originally I was interested in belief systems, broadly speaking, and I found religious belief to be really interesting, and that's kind of what I focused on, looking at this dogma in religion and this like really strong ideological adherence to some sort of belief system that really motivates people to process information in a certain way. And for that, I was actually really looking at religious beliefs and fundamentalist religious beliefs that motivated people to process information consistent with their religious ideology. So it was kind of interesting that I was so focused on religion that even though politics is this whole other big thing that's also ideology and motivates people to process information and according to their partisanship, I started looking at belief systems through the lens of religiosity. And then that's when I moved more into politics, was seeing that. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. I started like broad, like my first interests were just like broad social influence, social psychology of belief, like Solomon Asch conformity studies, that kind of stuff. That's what I really got excited about these topics. And then I actually drifted more into neuroscience, and I was studying just how the brain processes things differently depending on the neural structures that we have. Or even I spent a summer working in a hospital seeing brain injury patients, and just I got really interested in how the brain will respond differently to stimuli depending on if it's injured or not. So this like all these external stimuli that impact information processing was kind of big picture what I was interested in. And then I started studying politics at the end of graduate school, and then also during my first postdoc at Vanderbilt, with also a connection to health attitudes, since politics and health have been so linked, especially lately. So that's kind of my journey. Is this kind of a flip side of what you've gone through. So it's kind of fun to hear your experience, and how there's some overlap, but also some differences as well.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating journey, and I sort of wish I had some of that psychology. I just did. It was sort of a different time, older, so it was a different. You didn't have. There was a lot more siloing, I think, in academia. And then there is now. And there were some studies in political science going back to that time period, but it just never came up really in any of my classes. It wasn't as widespread as it is now. And now I just absolutely find the research, so interesting, but also so meaningful and so important.
Yeah.
And it's much more so, I think, than what that I was studying at the time, which I still loved and was still super passionate about it and super interested in it. But this stuff just seems so much more relevant, to me now.
Yeah, I felt the same way. And that's why, it's funny because I never really considered political science as an undergraduate, because it was presented to me in kind of the topics you were describing, which again is important stuff. And I do find it much more interesting now. But at the time, it seemed a little bit more abstract, and it seemed like you kind of had to be like a political nerd to really find it interesting. Right. And again, as an undergrad, I really was not political at all. Like, I didn't follow politics. I voted, but like I didn't really know what I was doing.
Right.
So it's just funny to think about how that changes over time. So then how did you, so you had your critical thinking class, you had this background in political science, but you also wrote a book in 2022 on political tribalism. So can you share about how that journey came to be? Did that come from your political background? Because I know you talk about like some critical thinking, media literacy stuff in there. Like, how did your book journey come to be?
It was just basically I was sort of reading all this research, keeping up with all this research, and I kept waiting for somebody a lot smarter than me and a better writer than me to write a book that consolidated all this stuff in one place. I was just so excited with all of this research. To me, it was so mind-blowing and revealing, and I was going through this, this personal process as I was learning about this stuff, recognizing it in my own behavior. And so I started changing as a person, as a thinker. And when you have that, you want to share it. You want other people to know about this, because I just thought some of these, I highlight a handful of studies in the book. Like there's a lot of different studies in the book, but the key chapters are all sort of based upon one major study that I just think was fascinating. And I'm like, more people need to know about these studies and need to understand that they do this, right? That we're all doing. And so I was just kind of waiting. I'm like, gosh, I wish someone would do this book. And then I wrote an article for a magazine about it. And this author who's written a lot of books on critical thinking, his name's Guy Harrison, he read that article and then he sent me an email and he said, hey, that was a really great article. You should write a book about this. And that kind of got the process rolling. And he's like, I'll help you. This is how you do a proposal and all this stuff. And he was very helpful. And so that got me thinking about it. And I also, at the time, I had a regular column in a local newspaper where it was always critical thinking in politics. So I had all of this material. And so then I just started to try to put it in book form and have a central thesis and organization and all that stuff. And so it sort of was organic over the course of several years, where I was thinking, I wish someone would write this. Maybe I'll write it. No, I'll never be able to, find the time to do this. And then when Guy Harrison contacted me, I'm like, I'm going to do this. Okay, I'm going to do it. And so that's what really propelled me to actually sit down and really start writing and thinking about the concept of actually having it all as a book, as a single whole. But, it was also what I was seeing happening in the country. There's so much attention in political science on affective polarization and polarization in general, and what's happening to our politics, and then the rise of social media and all the stuff, echo chambers and all that kind of thing. it was just, so that was the political scientist part of me that was saying, again, a lot of this is being written about, but a lot of it's in academic journals, or you're seeing think pieces on it, but it's on maybe, echo chambers, or on how Democrats and Republicans perceive things differently, or how they might evaluate evidence differently, but it wasn't all in one package. And what I try to do in the book is, it's like I walk through the thinking process. First we're exposed first we have our identities, right? And so I talk a little bit about where we get our political identities from, which is a huge debate and fascinating debate in political science. But we start there. I sort of have this, what I call the tribal theory of democracy, and I contrast that with what political scientists call the folk theory. And the folk theory is the ideal citizen, right? That you sit down, say, okay, well, it's almost election time. What are all the issues in this campaign? I'm going to research all of these issues. I'm going to look at the pros and the cons. I'm going to see what Democrats say about it, Republicans say about it. I'm going to study these to the best of my ability, and then I'll figure out where I stand, and then I'll compare that to where the candidates stand, and then I'll vote for that candidate, right? And that's ideally how this is supposed to work, but it's really just a flip of that model where we start with our party, we start with our identity, and that completely warps everything else. It warps our thinking. So it warps the information that we look for. It warps when we actually see information, how we perceive it. Democrats and Republicans could look at the same newspaper article, the same event, and they see it completely differently because of their identities. It affects how we evaluate information. It completely flips the democratic ideal on its head. And I saw that, in my own behavior before I started learning about this stuff and reading about this stuff. And then it's just ubiquitous, right? I mean, it's everywhere. If you follow politics, it's everywhere. And I think that's dangerous for democracy. There's a lot of reasons why that's dangerous for democracy, that, polarization, but it goes beyond that. For what does representation mean, and democratic accountability. There's a lot of problems with not thinking critically when it comes to politics. And so I just felt that there was this need for a book that took everything that I learned about critical thinking and really just applied it to politics, and to try to get people to really, you don't have to give up your party, but you have to give up your tribal allegiances to that party and really start to think for ourselves rather than allow our parties to think for us, and expose yourself to different points of view and try to see that from different perspectives and try to evaluate it in an as earnestly and objectively as you can. So the book talks about a lot of this research. It breaks it down into those steps, gathering information, perceiving it, evaluating it. And at the end of each chapter, there's a series of, so this is the problem, and these are solutions that you can take in your personal life, because there are larger structural things, I think, that have to happen. And there's a lot of great political scientists writing about that stuff. The gets into gerrymandering and proportional representation, stuff like that. The media landscape. But my book tries to, okay, that would be great, if some of those things happen and it can improve our state, our democracy, but those are big things. What can you do, a citizen sitting at home and you're troubled by what you see? What can you do on a daily basis that doesn't require a constitutional amendment or something like that? And there are steps that I took in my personal life, like as I was learning about this stuff, and I still struggle with it every day. I mean, I have my political identity, right? But I catch myself constantly, and that's the key. You never really arrive as a critical thinker. It's something that you work on every day, and I catch myself all the time, but I never used to catch myself because I wasn't aware that there was anything to catch. And once I learned that, and I saw how different I was becoming, and my behavior about the information that I was looking for, and the questions now that I knew to ask when I was looking at this information. As a teacher, when you come across stuff like that, this great research that's exciting and mind-blowing, you want to share it. And this was what I was trying to do, to share it with as many people as I could. So that was a long answer, but that's why I embarked on this project. And as you know, I mean, there were many times throughout the process where I was like, why did I start this? Why did I go to it? I mean, it was had my first son, so we had, and it was COVID, and I mean, there was a lot going on
Yeah.
in my life, but I'm really glad that I did it because I learned a lot by writing, as writing is thinking. So
Right.
as I was writing it, I just learned so much more, and obviously researched a lot more, but also the opportunities it's given me to be on podcasts and to teach other classes. I do a lot of adult ed stuff and, a lot of speaking to different groups, and it's offered me those opportunities as well to share this information. So I'm really happy that I did it.
I'm happy you did it too. Yeah, I also can definitely relate to the journey and the struggle of a book. It took me about 5 years to beginning to end. And yeah, it's such a journey, but as you're reading and thinking about it, you really do, it feels like you can feel like the knowledge change you as you're constantly diving into this topic so much for so long. And I think that's one of the great things about books, as we go in this AI age where everything's summarized and spoon-fed to us. I worry that we're losing that deep thinking component of truly grappling with ideas in a way that's beyond the cliff notes. Because yeah, you can read the cliff notes, you can be like, okay, identities, they influence us, we're motivated to protect our identities. But what I hope is that whenever you read books like yours or like mine or similar books, it forces you to grapple with how that impacts you directly, and you literally like change your brain as you're reading and thinking about this, as opposed to just a quick like, okay, identities are important, and then you immediately move on to something else. So I'm still an advocate for books, even though they may be old-fashioned in these days. But I really think it's, like you mentioned, like writing is thinking, and reading is thinking. And again, it's just like one of the best ways to dive deeply into a new idea and challenge yourself. But it's a tough sell to get someone to sit down and read a book. And I guess that's kind of leads me to my next question for you, is like, okay, like I'm a big advocate of critical thinking. I'm a big advocate of people expanding their identities so that they're not so dependent on a narrow set of identities, such as, a political identity being super important to them to the point where they are very motivated to protect it at risk of falling for misinformation. So in this landscape where there's all these incentives to not think deeply, how do we get people to think more critically?
Oh boy, that's a great that's the question. I think, as you said, I mean, that the key word that you used is incentive, right? And there are so many actors right now that are incentivized to do the opposite, to try to get us to not think critically. I think a lot of that too is natural, obviously. I mean, heuristics and stuff like that, where, system one thinking versus system two thinking. We're built for system one thinking. Probably we evolved this way. And so even if you take out the modern media environment, the modern political environment, it still would be a challenge and a problem, but this is just, it's that on steroids now, right? I mean, we've got our nature, but now our nurture, the environment in which we're living, is just like pouring gasoline on that and lighting the match. So I think what we ideally have to do is change the incentive structures, but a lot of that again is big systematic changes to the media environment, to the incentives that our elected officials have. They're just responding to the incentives that they have. And so that might require structural changes to our electoral system and how we draw districts and how we hold elections. And there's a lot of good writing about that, and there's a good debate going on about that. And would that help or wouldn't it help? But I just think, and a lot of that stuff, I think those are big asks. I think that requires a lot of work. And that's why I was saying, with my book, I was more trying to appeal to the individual and say, like, because if it's all that structural stuff, it can seem overwhelming and it can seem kind of hopeless. But if it's stuff that you can do in your everyday life, and if you can read about this stuff and learn about this stuff and start to apply some of these things in your life, and then your family starts to see that and your friends start to see that, and that's how a lot of change can happen. a lot of significant change. And so I think it's the incentive for us, which is another point I try to drive home in the book is, that's the way we fix our politics, because right now our system was designed for people who have different points of view to sit together and to talk and to hash it out and to argue and debate and try to reach some kind of consensus so we have a common path going forward. It's not pretty, it's contentious, but that's the way our system is set up. And right now, we have a lot of people who they don't want to do that. So the way that we think about politics and the way that we're acting right now is completely at odds with the system that we have. And so we really, if we want to make that system work, we have to start behaving differently. And I think a lot of people acknowledge and recognize that our politics is kind of broken right now. And I think if it starts with the people and we start demanding that our elected officials start responding to the incentives that really should matter, that can change things. If we, through our media habits, start accessing information that makes an honest effort to be accurate, that presents both sides, that changes the incentive structure of the media industry, right? Everyone is flocking to your MSNBC or your Fox News or whatever because they want to hear what they want to hear, what agrees with them. If we change that sort of behavior, I used to watch cable news all the time, like religiously. I don't anymore. I changed, right? And so if you had a lot of people that sort of went on the same journey I went on, and a lot of people stopped watching those stations, they would change their behavior because that's how they make money. And so that's why I think you can have this stuff from the top down, but I think a lot of it can also be organic. It can go from the bottom up. We just need to encourage people to think critically. And again, that's hard because you're working against a lot of stuff, but that's why I'm trying to get at people when they're younger. But I think of what you're doing with the podcasts and books, and there's a lot of good podcasts, but it's just some of the stuff takes time, right? So 10 years ago, you never would hear confirmation bias. Now, like almost everybody knows what that is, right? And that's because it makes its way out of academia, like out of these, journal articles that are behind a paywall, and then some people start writing popular books about it, and then you start hearing it on podcasts, and it becomes part of the everyday vocabulary. And that's when change starts to happen, because people start to realize, oh, there's this thing called confirmation bias. And probably at first, we're just going to recognize it in other people and call them out on it. But then we might start to think, well, I do this too. And that's change, right? That's progress. And I think the same thing with, my students, and the technology changes so quickly. And, I'm teaching how to do reverse image searches, and what do we have? What programs do we have out there to see if a video is artificial intelligence or if it's accurate or not? And it's just always catch up, right? But that stuff is happening in schools now, and the technology changes so fast. But hopefully you get at these kids and you start to teach them to think this way and to use these tools, and hopefully they carry that with them. Whereas the older generations who aren't in school anymore, they may not have been in school for 40 years. They don't know any of this stuff, right? When they were in school, we weren't talking about this stuff. I wasn't taught this stuff when I was in school. So I had to learn it all on my own. Hopefully, if we can get this into the schools and we can teach kids these skills, then they'll be better off, down the road, even when they're out of school. But there is no easy answer, at least that I know of. It's a really tough nut to crack, but I think you got a lot of people doing a lot of really good work, and I hope I'm an optimistic person by nature, and so I think a lot of people doing a lot of good work is making a difference. I'm sure you've seen that with some people who've read your book and reached out or whatever, or when you talk about this stuff in your podcast or what, you reach people. It's one person at a time or a couple people at a time, but that's ultimately how we'll make a difference, I hope.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's evidence for that beyond just hope. And I also try to be an optimistic person, but we can look at, to your point earlier, like the discussion in popular discourse about confirmation bias and how it used to be this niche thing among, psychology nerds would know about it. And now it's just part of everyday discourse with a lot of people bringing it up. And I think it'd be similar, hopefully, and this is what I hope to do and what your work hopes to do is like get like the identity protective cognition conversations up. It's a kind of how I think about it is like, okay, what causes confirmation bias? Like, okay, we have these biases, but where do they come from? And how can we unpack those? So yeah, I do think it takes time, and I do think there's a lot of power in network effects. So yes, focusing on the individual is really important, but then as you mentioned earlier, like, are they going to talk about this with their friends and their family? And then those people will talk about it with their friends and family. And then that's how it really spreads, and you can change social norms in a way that hopefully will make us collectively more focused on evidence and critical thinking and being more thoughtful. So I wanted to ask you more specifically about your critical thinking class. So, I mean, I think that's really awesome that you're teaching students these skills at an early age. I think a lot of people are on board for this. So I was curious if you could just share more about the nuts and bolts of your class. Like what are some of the highlights that you try to teach to your students? And then, you mentioned some of the challenges of technology, but like what does that class look like for teenagers? Like what grades first off do you reach?
I love teaching it. It's so fun. And they love taking it. So unfortunately, it is just an elective. I wish it was a required course, but so it's open to sophomores, juniors, and seniors. And I did write a more detailed deep dive into the class for Skeptical Inquirer. If anyone wants to just
I can link that
up. So I start with identity, because that's why your work just really resonated with me so much, because I think that's where it all begins. And so I start with identity, and we talk about the power of identity, and that's really where sort of like I get into the stuff in my book where how we have these group attachments, we have all these different identities, so we have those conversations, and then why does that lead to, why could it lead to cognitive dissonance and confirmation bias and disconfirmation bias? And then I talk about seeking information, perceiving information, evaluating information. And so all of that is like group identity and how it affects our thinking. And so I essentially broke it down into, the critical thinking, we have to evaluate the source of information, and we have to critically evaluate the claim, whatever claim is being made. We also have to evaluate the receiver of that information, right? Like who's getting that information, and that's where I actually start, and that's the identity part. It's like, and the focus is really on us. So what biases do we have that impinge upon how we evaluate information and so on? So after we do a lot on that, and you talk about in your book, the Behind the Curve. I showed them that documentary in class, which is fantastic, right? Yeah. For understanding the power of identity. And that really resonates with kids, because they could see how those folks, how they have this strong sense of community, and how that's even it's juxtaposed with the scientists, right? Who have their own community. The flat earthers are having their meetings, right? Their conventions, and so are the scientists, right? And it's just so great for really showing them how strong identities are, how they affect our thinking. And then we spend time unpacking their identities. Like, what are your different identities, and how do you think that affects your thinking? And so we start there, and then I get into sources. So that's more your media literacy stuff. And so this is your typical kind of, which again, like you were saying, and why I appreciated your work, because a lot of quote critical thinking or media literacy, if it was taught in say some English classes or in libraries and things like that, it was usually the media literacy stuff, but there's little to none of cognitive biases stuff. Unless maybe you take psych, but it's really like, so I spent a lot of time on group identity and the cognitive biases that are sort of interwoven with that. But then we do the media literacy stuff. So what makes a good source, and what makes an expert, and why do we have to be careful about, faulty authority, bias, and stuff like that. And so we dig into a lot of that. And then, your typical, I talk about media bias there, the hostile media effect I get into with the kids, which is fascinating. And then just how to, as I was saying earlier, reverse image search, or you come across a video, how do you fact check this? And What is it about, do lateral reading. So we spend a lot of time practicing lateral reading. Immediately open up another tab, search the author, search the website, like that kind of thing. And then the last part, the third major chunk, is evaluating claims. And so that is where I get into a lot of like research method stuff with high school kids. I mean, wow. It's pretty like intense. I mean, we talk about regression analyses, and we get into the whole publication process. So we talk about the importance of peer review and replication and all of these things, and experimental designs, and talk about different kinds of experiments. I mean, it's not a college level course, but it's, these are the things that you want to look for. Like if you're coming across, you come across someone said, oh, I got to study for this or study for that. Give them like a list, like what are some things that you want to look for that aren't a guarantee that this thing is perfect by any stretch, but here's, 10 things that you can look for that'll give you more confidence. Was there a random sample where people assigned randomly? Was there a control group or whatever? We talk about correlation and causation and extraneous variables, spurious variables, confounding variables, all that stuff. And so they get a much better understanding of what good science is, what makes some research better than other research, and and so we do all of that. And then we also do a lot with evaluating an argument. So we teach them how to map out arguments. Then we talk about formal arguments and informal arguments, and deductive logic and inductive, and we get into logical fallacies, which is a lot of fun. So we learn about all these different logical fallacies. So it's, when they are done with this class, and it's fun because at the end I give them an argument, and it's a pretty simple argument I just pulled from actually a Nick Kristof editorial, and it's just given part of it like a paragraph. I'm like, okay, so let's evaluate this. And it's like awesome to watch them because they ask questions that they never would have been able to ask at the beginning of the year. And so they look at it and they're like, lateral read, who is this guy Nick Kristof? Okay, New York Times, let's look up this guy. Okay, so, and they're doing that. Is he an expert in this? Okay, and they have that conversation. And, and then they're like, okay, what about my biases? So this argument, the one is about the legalization of drugs argument. And so they're like, what are my personal opinions on this? And is that going to affect how I look at or interpret this argument he's making? And we map out the argument, right? What's the conclusion? What are the premises? And then evaluate the claim. So like, okay, so he makes this claim. Well, how can we find out if that claim's actually true? So then they go to like the CDC website, and they go to all these different websites, and like, well, this is what the CDC is saying on their website, and he doesn't totally, like, they're much more like, we don't really know necessarily, and he's much more strident in what he says, and so I don't really know if he's representing the research accurately. And it's like incredible to watch this process. And then they identify some logical fallacies, and and after we go through that process, you could just see they're like, wow. where they would have before the class, they would have maybe seen it, read it, and been like, that's interesting, but never. It's like, okay, guys, we just spent 30 minutes, right, diving into these 4 or 5 sentences, and look at all of the questions that you asked that you never would have asked those questions. It's amazing. And I tell them you're not going to have the time to do this with everything that you come across in your daily life, but when there's really important decisions to be made, or there's really important stuff going on in the country, like, we got to spend some of this time. And now you're equipped with these questions. But we do a ton of fun stuff too. Like we talk about Bigfoot. They do a final project where they have to take one of the concepts they learned in class. It could be a cognitive bias or whatever. And then they have to pick, I give them like a list of 30 different topics: crop circles, Bigfoot, astrology, psychics, like all kinds of fun stuff. And they have to take one of the concepts they learned in class and apply it to that thing. So remember the hits, forget the misses, and they might apply that to the Bermuda Triangle. And then so they do like a little bit of research on the Bermuda Triangle and say, well, this is why. So this is what the Bermuda Triangle, this is what people think's going on. But really what's happening is people are remembering the hits and they're forgetting the misses. And here's all the data of all the planes that go through there. Nothing ever happens. So it's just they're exercising those critical thinking skills on a particular topic. But I mean, I'll just say one other thing because I'm getting long-winded here. But another thing I do, because I'm located in Buffalo, New York. The Center for Inquiry has actually started here at UB, and they have their offices here. And there's like a ghost debunker guy who used to be a ghost hunter, and then it completely changed. His name's Kenny Biddle, and he does like a lot of great YouTube stuff where there'll be like some video on TikTok where, you know, these people say like, my house is haunted, and they show this like video, lights flicking on and off or cabinets opening up. And what he does is he debunks those, and he will show you how they did it, and he'll recreate these videos, and they're great, you know. And it's like, I mean, I watch these things all the time, and I'm like, how did they do this? How did they pull this off? And then he does. I'm like, oh, yeah. And so, you know, when he does, I'm like, oh, yeah, that's so obvious. But I was, you know, I didn't believe it was true. Like I knew somehow they were doing, but I couldn't figure out how. And then he does it. It's like, oh yeah, that's how they did it. And so he comes into class as a guest speaker, and he brings in all of this like these cool things to tell the kids these stories about, you know, different debunking things that he did and certain, you know, alleged haunted houses and stuff. And it's just a lot of fun. I mean, the content, there's a lot of fun content, but there's also a lot of real, like they're learning stuff. And these high school kids, they can take it and they can learn it. And I'll just share one last story about that. I had a kid come up to me after break. It would have been spring break. So this would have been while I was teaching in the spring a couple years ago. And we talk about the idiomotor effect, that we can, you know, have these, we don't even know, but we're making these subtle movements, you know. So this is how like people say magic crystals work, or a Ouija board or something like that, right? And so I actually bring in a quote magic crystal, and we play with it, and kids are like, whoa, you know, and they really think they're moving it with their mind. And then we talk about the idiomotor effect and how it's with Ouija boards and magic crystals and all this stuff, and they're like blown away by it, you know. And so the student was on spring break, and she came back, and she was so excited, like the first day after break, she's like, Dr. Redmond, you're never gonna believe what happened. So we were walking down the boardwalk, this is in Florida, and this lady tried selling me a magic crystal. And I was with my mom, and I was like, no, we don't want one. No, thank you. We walked away. And her mom's like, what was that all about? She's like, Mom, it's just the idiomotor effect. And she taught her mom about the idiomotor effect. Wow. You know, and it's just like, great. It's those moments that make teaching worthwhile. And because like that, talking about grassroots, right, bottom up, there's a kid who learned something in class, didn't waste their money on that magic crystal, told her mom about it. Like that's how change happens, one person at a time. So I love the class. I love teaching it, and it's one of the highlights of my day. You know, seeing the effect that it has on kids is encouraging.
Yeah, I mean that's amazing. That's definitely something that I would want to take as a student and also teach. Like it's really in my wheelhouse. But I love the structure that you did it. Like again, like this is my bias of interested in the psychology behind it, but that's exactly how I would start it, is starting with the psychology. So basically you're covering like psychological literacy, media literacy, and scientific literacy.
Yeah.
And I think you need all three of those combined to really get at teaching how to process evidence more accurately and objectively. And I think finally, there's more people doing this, but you can't really teach those skills in isolation. I don't think they're as effective, I would argue. Have you looked at any like outcome variables of like students after they take the class, or just like you mentioned some really cool anecdotes, but I'm curious if you've measured the ability to discern headlines or just like do students like it? Like do you get good reviews after they take it?
Before I get into that, I really love how you just framed that. Those three literacy pillars is really great. I love that. I know nothing that I would say is scientific. I do an anonymous survey. I've got, I think like 14 or 15 statements. We just had our first day today, actually, so I did this in the class today. There's a mix of, like crop circles are created by aliens. Do you agree? unsure, you disagree. So there's like some false statements for that, like Ouija boards can communicate with the dead. And then there's some true statements in there, human behavior is contributing to climate change, vaccines are safe and effective. And so I gather that data before class, and then I give them the same survey at the end, and there's drastic changes. Again, it's some of this, are they trying to make me happy at the end of the year? It is anonymous, so I don't know, but they might be, trying to make me feel good about the class. I don't know. But there's like dramatic changes, where maybe 50% of people believe in ghosts at the start of the class, and then no one does at the end of the class. I spent a lot of time on the Kennedy assassination, and at the beginning of class, the first survey, again, like 60% might agree that there was a conspiracy, and afterwards it might be 5% or something like that. So you see these massive shifts, and you even see it in things that I don't cover in class. So I don't always get to cryptids, and some of the years that I haven't got to cryptids, there's a thing in there like Bigfoot is real. You even see that shift when I cover it and when I don't cover it. So it seems to be that these kids are applying sort of some of this stuff to other topics. But how much of that is, I don't know. I haven't really done a truly scientific experiment. It's just more of my kind of curiosity to see if there's been any changes. But I've been doing that for years, and it's been consistent where I see these massive shifts. How enduring that is, how long it lasts, I don't know. And then I also just do, end of the year anecdotal, hey, what did you like about the class? What do you think? How could I improve it? That sort of thing. And in the comments, like, again, you have a relationship with these kids, so are they going to be honest and tell you, like, yeah, this class sucked, But they're universally positive, where kids are just like, this was fascinating. I feel like a much better thinker now. I'm asking questions I never asked before. I never even knew to ask those questions before. So I think it's been a super positive experience for me, and I think for the students as well.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds amazing, and I am thankful that you're able to do that work, and I hope more teachers will be able to. I know New York State seems to be one of the more positive states towards teaching media literacy in curriculums. I would like to see it everywhere, but I guess that's part of the structural forces that we talked about as well, and it takes people pushing for this at their own institution to make it more universal. I think it's absolutely crucial to teach kids these skills and teach adults these skills as well. It's just a matter of trying to reach as many people as we can and make it as scalable as we can.
Yeah, and I think, the key piece, and going back to like that sort of three-legged stool you talked about, you do have media literacy in some library programs and English programs and even social studies programs. In science class, they do learn some scientific literacy. They talk about scientific methods and experimentation and control groups and things like that. If they take some math, stats, they get some regression, so they're getting some of those pieces. But I think there's two problems with that. One, it's very siloed. And so they don't, like, in my class, it's all there. And I've had kids like say, my gosh, this is like connecting everything that I've been learning in all these other classes. And they didn't see how it all fit together, right? They don't see social science as like science, right?
Yeah.
And they didn't see math as being relevant to like science or what. So this class brings all of that stuff together, and they see how what they were learning in stats relates to what they were learning in physics or bio or chem and what they were learning in English. That, I think, is important, to have it all in one class. The other thing that's missing is what you called like psychology literacy or psych literacy. And that's the identity stuff, right? And they do get some of that in psych. Like they talk about Salman Ash in psych, but again, that's an elective, so not every kid gets that. And I cover over 50 cognitive biases, in my class. You don't get that in other classes. So I think these classes are so This kind of class is so important because it brings all of that into one place. It emphasizes identity, it emphasizes cognitive biases, and maybe that's going to become more part of the stream in the future, as more and more people are talking about this and advocating for classes like this. But I think it's really important to be taught in one place, and because that's where you really start to see the relevance of it. And so you do hear like a lot of teachers saying, well, I teach critical thinking. Of course we teach critical thinking. And that's true, but I don't think it's as effective as it could be if it were packaged in one critical thinking class. So that's my 2 cents on that. Teachers do it and they do a good job at it, but we could do better.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up. I think the integration of those 3 pillars is really the key to, the secret sauce, the greatest share of variance, if you want to think about the statistical terms of it. I really do think that integration and interdisciplinary approach makes a huge difference. It multiplies, has a multiplying effect as opposed to an additive effect of having it siloed. Being able to synthesize ideas in that way, especially for these topics, I think is critical. So that's super cool. And I mean, as we move forward, hopefully we'll see more progress as a more comprehensive approach to media literacy. Whereas, yeah, like when I say media literacy, to me, it's like what you're describing in your class, but that's not the case for a lot of media literacy classes. It is just very much, how do you look up a headline and the funding sources behind an author or something like that. Right. So, yeah, really, really cool to hear everything you've been working on. I'm curious, like, what's next for you with your own classes? Do you have another book in the works? Like, what are you thinking about next in the future?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I'm not sure. Going back and forth between sort of trying to figure out some way I can share what I've done with this class, and whether that's in book form or whether that's sort of like something I put up on YouTube. I don't know, but I do want to share it, more. And so I'm thinking about that. I also sort of bandied around an idea of a book about just, it would be similar, that would take off on certain parts of my book, but again, like the identity and what that would sort of could potentially lead to with political violence and things like that, and how do we break out of this cycle. And there's a lot of really interesting stuff on political stereotyping, how Democrats and Republicans think they're so much more different than they really are. Democrats and Republicans think the other side hates them so much more than they do. And so there's a lot of that I think, a lot of great research on that. I kind of feel the same way. There's a lot of great research on this and people need to hear about it and know about it. I don't know if there's enough there for a book. So I'm kind of going back and forth between those 2 ideas right now. I definitely want to do another one. Mm-hmm. So I'm just, trying to figure it out if there's enough material there, how I would organize it and stuff like that. But those are the 2 things I would say that are kind of rolling around in my head right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think there'd be a lot of people interested in learning these skills. I mean, I just started my own similar class through my Substack, just an online course for everyone, and people seem to enjoy it. This is something that I just did kind of spur of the moment. And I think making more of these curriculums more accessible to more people not only presents the skills to more people, which we both agree is important, but also it kind of pushes it in that mainstream discourse of like, oh, people are talking about these 3 pillars that we described, and it's like, oh, maybe they should be in schools, and then it kind of spreads from there. So yeah, if you want to, I don't know if you're interested in doing something like that, or then sharing your journey of, I've taught critical thinking for 10 years, here's what I learned, and then putting it in book format. I think there's a few interesting stories there, so it kind of depends on what you want to do.
Yeah, it's definitely important work, and it's something like I'm passionate about. I just have to get those thoughts down on paper. But I do think there's, for me, straddling between, because I'm an adjunct at a local university here too, so like sort of straddling between academia and high school, and it kind of gives me a unique perspective. And I think, I hope at least, I mean, there are parts in my book is pretty wonky, and I think I could have done a much better job. Writing, I still think I had academic writing beaten into me, in grad school.
Sure.
And I really respect and admire people that can write for a more general audience. I think I teach that. I'm much better at teaching that way because I'm, with high school students and, in front of me. But I think when I write, I kind of revert to that academic kind of writing. But I do think straddling those two worlds, it gives me, the ability to take the academia stuff and try to get it to younger people in a way that they can understand it and get what they need to get at that particular age. And so I would like to help because I think there's a little bit of a void there, speaking to high school students about this stuff. I mean, there's a lot of people doing really good work on this as well, but at least I think I could maybe help contribute to that discourse because I am teaching this stuff in school, and I'd love to share, as you said, what I learned, my curriculum, how I structure the class, the stuff that I cover. I'd love to share that with a wider audience, and so yeah, that might be the road that I go down.
Great. I mean, that sounds like a great road to me. So if people are interested in finding your current work and current writing, where can they find you online?
Well, I don't have a huge social media presence because I don't know, I try not to become super involved with that stuff. I am on X. You could find me at TJ Redmo, TJREDMO. But I mostly use it as a cloud. I just post stuff that I find interesting. I don't comment all that much, but I just, if you just search online, you can find the book. It's, on Amazon or any bookstore. You just search my name, Timothy J. Redmond, and you'll see any podcasts that I've been on or any articles that I've written. Those are for the most part, those are posted online. And, you could follow me on Amazon, Author Central, and, for any new work that will come out. But yeah, I'm not a great self-promoter, but I probably should do a lot more social media stuff, but I've got a lot of other stuff too is going on. So
That's fair. That's fair.
I've really, I told you I cut back on cable. I've really cut back on social media as well, but yeah, but they can find me there.
Yeah. It's definitely a tricky balance for sure. But Tim, thank you so much for joining me. I really enjoyed learning about all of your work, and I think my listeners will really appreciate learning from everything you had to share with us today.
Well, thank you for having me, Matthew. And as I said earlier, I'm a big fan of your work, and thank you for everything that you're doing because it's critically important, and you're doing great work. And love the book, love the podcast, and so thank you.
Thank you so much.